The morning fog hung low over the Potomac River on June 22, 1861. Washington, D.C. had become a city of nervous anticipation. Confederate forces were somewhere beyond the misty horizon, their numbers unknown, their intentions unclear. In an office overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell spread out a map across his oak desk. The ink markings showed the Union positions, but large empty spaces dominated the southern portion of the chart. Intelligence reports from scouts were contradictory, fragmentary. Some claimed 10,000 rebels waited at Manassas Junction. Others insisted the number was twice that. According to military records recovered from the National Archives in 1942, McDowell was under immense pressure. President Lincoln demanded action. The northern newspapers cried for a swift advance to crush the rebellion. "On to Richmond," was the popular call. But McDowell knew the danger of moving an army without proper reconnaissance. A handwritten note in his personal journal, only declassified in 1939, revealed his frustration. "Cannot advance blindly. The President wishes immediate action, but I cannot see through forests and hills. The enemy could be anywhere." That same afternoon, a civilian scientist named Thaddeus Lowe requested an audience with President Lincoln. According to White House visitor logs from 1861, Lowe was granted a brief meeting scheduled for 4 o'clock. What transpired during that meeting would change the course of military intelligence gathering for the Union Army. Lowe had been experimenting with balloons for years. A self-educated man from New Hampshire, he had achieved notoriety for his long-distance balloon flights. Newspaper clippings from the Philadelphia Inquirer, dated 1859, described him as the most daring aeronaut in America. But on that June afternoon, he was not proposing entertainment or scientific experiments. He was offering the Union Army something they desperately needed: eyes that could see beyond the horizon. White House records indicate the meeting lasted only 17 minutes. What was said remains largely unknown, but a telegram sent from Lincoln's secretary to the War Department that evening contained a curious directive. "The President requests that military facilities be made available to Professor Lowe for demonstration purposes tomorrow morning. Location, Mall grounds." The telegram was filed and forgotten until 1894, when a War Department clerk discovered it while organizing old communications. The following day dawned clear and warm. According to weather records maintained by the Smithsonian Institution, June 23, 1861 saw temperatures reaching 84 degrees by 9 in the morning, with minimal cloud cover. Perfect conditions for what Lowe had planned. Army quartermaster records show that at 6:30 that morning, a wagon carrying a large canvas bag, wicker basket, and several iron tanks of hydrogen gas arrived at the mall. Curious onlookers gathered as Lowe directed the unloading of his equipment. By 7:15, a balloon began to take shape. Its silk envelope expanded as gas hissed into it from the tanks. Within the hour, a massive globe towered over the spectators, straining against the ropes that held it to the ground. A dispatch rider named Samuel Thompson, attached to the War Department, was present that morning. His account, documented in a letter to his brother in Boston, described what happened next. The civilian climbed into the basket beneath the balloon. With him went a peculiar apparatus, a telegraph key fixed to a board. Wires ran from it to the ground. As the balloon rose, the wires played out. Soon the man was 500 feet above us, a tiny figure against the blue sky. Yet somehow he was still communicating with officials on the ground. It was as if he had abolished distance itself. This was the first instance of a telegraphic message being sent from an aerial vehicle in military history. Lowe's innovation wasn't just the balloon. It was the combination of aerial observation with instant communication, according to telegraph records preserved by the U.S. Signal Corps archives, at 8:43 a.m., a message was transmitted from the balloon to the telegraph office. View extends for approximately 30 miles in all directions, can clearly distinguish camps, roads, and movement of large bodies of men. T. Lowe. President Lincoln himself had arrived at the demonstration. His presence was not recorded in any official White House calendar, but 3 independent witness accounts place him at the mall that morning. The president's reaction to Lowe's achievement went unrecorded in any official document, but journalist Noah Brooks, in notes for an article that was never published, wrote, "Mr. Lincoln squinted up at the balloon, a hand shading his eyes. When the telegraph operator announced the receipt of Lowe's message, a slow smile spread across the president's face. This changes matters considerably," he said to no one in particular. By noon, the demonstration was over. Lowe returned to Earth, the balloon was deflated and packed away, and the crowd dispersed. What happened next was documented only fragmentarily in scattered records across multiple departments. A requisition form dated June 24th shows an order for materials suitable for the construction of aeronautical apparatus, silk fabric, cordage, and hydrogen generation equipment. The form bears the signature of Secretary of War Simon Cameron. Less than a week later, Lowe was given an official, if somewhat ambiguous, position. A letter of appointment, discovered in Lowe's personal papers, donated to the Smithsonian in 1938, designated him as Chief Aeronaut of the Army of the Potomac. The position came with no military rank, no uniform, and initially no dedicated staff. Lowe occupied a peculiar grey area, neither fully civilian nor properly military. This ambiguous status would later prove problematic. Military correspondence from early July 1861 reveals confusion regarding Lowe's role. A letter from Colonel Andrew Porter to General McDowell questioned, "What authority does this balloon man have? He requests supplies and assistance, but presents no proper military authorization. Please advise." McDowell's response has been lost to history, but subsequent requisition forms show that Lowe continued to receive materials and support, suggesting the matter was resolved in his favor. By mid-July, intelligence gathering had become critical. Union forces were preparing to advance toward Manassas Junction, where Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard were known to be concentrated. The exact strength and disposition of these forces remained a mystery that conventional scouts had failed to solve. Records from the Army of the Potomac's intelligence section, only declassified in 1922, show that reports from cavalry scouts were contradictory, with estimates of Confederate strength ranging from 8,000 to over 30,000 men. On July 18th, 3 days before the planned advance, Lowe conducted his first operational ascent. The launch location, according to a field report filed by Captain Albert Meyer of the Signal Corps, was approximately 3 miles east of Centerville, in a clearing shielded from distant observation by a stand of oak trees. Weather conditions were noted as favorable, with light southeasterly winds and clear visibility. The balloon, which Lowe had named the Enterprise, carried him to an altitude of approximately 800 feet. From there, according to the telegraph transcript preserved in Signal Corps records, Lowe reported, "Confederate forces concentrated around Manassas Junction. Extensive fortifications visible. Estimate at least 20 regiments present. Additional forces observed moving from the southwest along the Warrenton Turnpike. Smoke from numerous campfires suggests recently arrived troops." This intelligence was immediately relayed to McDowell's headquarters. A staff meeting was hastily convened, as documented in the journal of Lieutenant Colonel James B. Fry, McDowell's chief of staff. "Balloon intelligence confirms our worst fears. The enemy is present in strength far greater than our prior estimates. The general is reconsidering the planned route of advance." McDowell's original plan had been to execute a frontal assault on the Confederate positions at Manassas. Lowe's intelligence revealed this would be suicidal. Instead, McDowell developed a more complex flanking maneuver, hoping to strike the Confederate left while fixing their center with a diversionary attack. This change of plan required additional preparation. The advance, originally scheduled for July 19th, was delayed until the 21st. On the morning of July 21st, the Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas as it was known in the South, began. Lowe attempted to ascend again to observe the battle, but historical records indicate a problematic development. A report from Lieutenant George Abbott of the Topographical Engineers stated, "Balloon grounded due to increasing winds from the west. Attempted launch at 0730 and again at 0900 without success. Professor Lowe reports conditions unsafe for ascent." The absence of aerial observation may have contributed to what followed. The Union flanking movement initially went well, catching the Confederates by surprise, but as the day progressed, Confederate reinforcements arrived from the Shenandoah Valley via the Manassas Gap Railroad, the very movement Lowe had partially observed days earlier but could not confirm on the day of battle. The result was a stunning Confederate victory. The Union Army broke and retreated in disorder back to Washington. Military historians have debated ever since whether timely aerial intelligence on the day of battle might have alerted Union commanders to the arriving Confederate reinforcements in time to adapt their plans. In the aftermath of the defeat, recriminations flew. According to War Department correspondence from early August 1861, some officers blamed Lowe for failing to provide intelligence during the battle itself. A particularly scathing letter from Colonel William T. Sherman claimed, "This balloon business proved useless when most needed, a pretty toy for fair weather, nothing more." Sherman's assessment was forwarded to the Secretary of War, who requested an explanation. Lowe's written response, preserved in the National Archives, was measured but firm. No aeronaut, however dedicated, can overrule the laws of nature. The winds on July 21st made ascent impossible without risking destruction of the balloon and loss of life. I note that even the artillery found their operations hampered by the same winds that prevented my ascent. President Lincoln, according to a diary entry by Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, dated August 4th, took a more pragmatic view. The President remarked today that we should not discard a useful tool because it could not perform miracles. The balloon saw what men on horseback could not, and if we failed to heed its warnings before the battle, that was not the fault of the balloon or its operator. This presidential support proved crucial. Rather than being abandoned, the Balloon Corps received expanded funding. A quartermaster requisition dated August 12, 1861, shows orders for materials sufficient for the construction of 4 additional aeronautical vessels per specifications provided by TSC. Lowe. The Balloon Corps was being expanded rather than disbanded. Throughout the fall of 1861, Lowe worked to improve his aerial observation capabilities. A report to the Topographical Engineers dated September 23rd detailed innovations. Have successfully tested an improved valve mechanism that allows more precise control of ascent and descent. Additionally, the telegraphic apparatus has been modified for greater reliability in varying weather conditions. The expanded Balloon Corps soon faced its next test. In March 1862, the Army of the Potomac, now commanded by General George B. McClellan, began its Peninsula Campaign, a massive amphibious operation aimed at capturing the Confederate capital of Richmond by approaching from the southeast via the Virginia Peninsula. Logistics records from the Quartermaster Corps show that Lowe and his balloons were assigned to the expedition. Transport manifests from the steamship USS Coatzacoalcos list aeronautical equipment among the cargo loaded at Alexandria on March 27, 1862. According to the ship's log, this included 2 inflated balloons secured to the deck under canvas covers, 4 gas generators, 16 supply wagons, and personnel of the aeronautical department. The Peninsula Campaign presented new challenges for aerial reconnaissance. The terrain was different from northern Virginia, more heavily wooded, with numerous swamps and water obstacles. A field report from Lowe to General McClellan, dated April 24th, stated, "Visibility, often limited by morning mists rising from the Chickahominy Swamp. Recommend ascents be conducted in mid-afternoon, when atmospheric conditions are most favorable." Throughout April and May, as Union forces slowly advanced up the peninsula toward Richmond, Lowe's balloons provided regular intelligence. Telegraphic transcripts preserved in the McClellan papers at the Library of Congress showed dozens of reports from aerial observation. One, dated May 18th, proved particularly significant. Extensive new fortifications observed east of Richmond, artillery emplacements being prepared on both banks of the Chickahominy. Enemy appears to be concentrating forces rather than dispersing. This intelligence contributed to McClellan's growing caution. Already inclined to overestimate enemy strength, the confirmation of substantial defenses reinforced his tendency toward elaborate preparation rather than bold action. A diary entry by McClellan from May 22nd noted, "Balloon reports confirm my suspicion that the enemy is present in overwhelming force. I have requested additional reinforcements before attempting to take Richmond." By late May, the Army of the Potomac was divided by the Chickahominy River, with 2 corps north of the river and 3 to the south. This division would prove nearly disastrous when Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston attacked on May 31st at the Battle of Seven Pines. According to meteorological records, May 30th and 31st saw heavy rainfall, with over 2 inches recorded at Harrison's Landing. These conditions prevented balloon operations at the critical moment. A report from Colonel Thomas L. Casey of the Engineering Corps, dated June 2nd, stated, "The Balloon Corps attempted to deploy on the morning of May 31st, but was prevented by high winds and continuing rain. The gas generators could not be operated effectively in such conditions. Once again, the balloons were grounded when their intelligence might have been most valuable." The Battle of Seven Pines ended in a tactical draw, but it had strategic consequences. Johnston was wounded, and command of the Confederate forces around Richmond passed to General Robert E. Lee. This change would profoundly alter the course of the war. In the weeks that followed, Lowe's balloons detected signs of Confederate activity, but could not discern Lee's intentions. A report from June 23rd noted, "Increased movement observed west of Richmond, nature and destination of forces unclear due to forest cover." This was the prelude to Lee's offensive that would become known as the 7 Days Battles. When the Confederate attack came on June 26th, the Union forces were caught by surprise. The subsequent week saw McClellan's army driven back down the peninsula in a series of bloody engagements. Throughout this period, balloon operations were intermittent at best. A report from Lowe to the topographical engineers, dated July 2nd, explained the difficulties. "Continual movement of our forces requires constant relocation of balloon equipment. By the time an inflation and launch can be prepared at a new position, the tactical situation has changed, requiring another move." Only managed 3 ascents of brief duration during the past 7 days. The Peninsula Campaign ended in failure for the Union. By August, the Army of the Potomac had been withdrawn from the peninsula entirely. In the recriminations that followed, the Balloon Corps again faced criticism. A congressional committee investigating the campaign's failure questioned the value of the aeronautical department. According to hearing transcripts dated September 18, 1862, Representative George H. Pendleton of Ohio asked, "What tangible benefit was derived from the considerable expense and logistical burden of transporting these balloons and their apparatus to the peninsula? It seems they provided little warning of the enemy's attacks." The response came not from Lowe, but from Brigadier General Andrew A. Humphreys, Chief Topographical Engineer. "The balloons provided invaluable mapping information that could not have been obtained by other means. That they could not operate effectively during periods of adverse weather is a limitation of the technology, not a failure of the concept or its execution." Despite this defense, the Balloon Corps saw its resources gradually diminished over the following months. Requisition requests from Lowe during the fall of 1862 show increasing notations of denied or deferred due to higher priorities. The Corps continued to operate, but with reduced effectiveness. The last major deployment of Union observation balloons came during the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. According to the official report of Major General Ambrose Burnside, who had replaced McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac, the balloons provided useful confirmation of enemy positions along Mary's Heights, though fog along the Rappahannock limited observations during critical periods. By early 1863, the Balloon Corps faced an existential threat. A War Department memorandum dated February 3rd questioned the continued utility of aeronautical operations given their considerable expense and the development of alternative reconnaissance methods. In March, the Corps was transferred from the topographical engineers to the Quartermaster Department, a bureaucratic move that placed it under the authority of officers with little appreciation for its specialized function. A letter from Lowe to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, dated April 14, 1863, protested, "The recent reduction in pay rates for aeronauts from $10 to $3 per day makes it impossible to retain qualified personnel. Those with the necessary scientific knowledge and courage for this hazardous duty can find far better compensation elsewhere." The letter received no recorded response. On May 25, 1863, Thaddeus Lowe submitted his resignation. In his final report, he wrote, "I remain convinced that aerial observation represents the future of military intelligence gathering. That we have not fully realized its potential during the present conflict reflects limitations of resources and imagination, not of the concept itself." Within weeks, the remaining balloons and equipment were placed in storage. The Union Army Balloon Corps had effectively ceased to exist. The full history of this pioneering unit might have been lost to history were it not for the efforts of a Signal Corps archivist named Benjamin Thompson. In 1894, while organizing warehoused records from the war, Thompson discovered a crate containing Lowe's official reports, telegraphic transcripts, and technical diagrams. According to Thompson's notes, these papers had been misfiled and nearly discarded as waste paper during an office relocation in 1867. Thompson recognized the historical significance of the documents and ensured their preservation. In 1912, he published a monograph titled Eyes Above the Battlefield, The United States Balloon Corps, 1861-1863. The work received little attention at the time, circulating primarily among military historians. It was not until World War I, when aerial observation became a crucial component of battlefield intelligence, that interest in Lowe's pioneering work revived. A memorandum from the Army Signal Corps, dated November 12, 1917, requested all available historical information regarding the balloon observation operations conducted during the Civil War. This renewed interest led to a more comprehensive examination of the Balloon Corps records. In 1939, historian Herbert Ashe gained access to previously restricted War Department archives. Among these were the personal papers of Brigadier General Irvin McDowell. Ash's subsequent article in the Journal of Military History revealed that McDowell had been far more appreciative of the balloon's contribution than was publicly known at the time. In a confidential report to the Secretary of War dated August 12, 1861, McDowell wrote, "The intelligence provided by Professor Lowe's observations confirmed the presence of Johnston's forces moving to reinforce Beauregard. Had we been able to act decisively on this information, the outcome at Bull Run might have been different. The failure was not in the intelligence received, but in our capacity to respond effectively to it." Further discoveries came in 1942 when the family of Captain Isaiah Lukens donated his wartime diary to the Smithsonian Institution. Lukens had served as a signal officer attached to Lowe's unit during the Peninsula Campaign. His diary entries provided previously unknown details about daily operations, including an entry from June 18, 1862. "Ascended with Professor Lowe this morning to 900 Faloft, observed considerable enemy movement west of Richmond, which we reported by telegraph. Upon our return, found our report had been filed without action, as the commanding general was preoccupied with preparations for a planned advance along the Chickahominy. Later developments suggest the movements we observed were the beginning of Jackson's march to join the main Confederate army." This entry suggests that critical intelligence was sometimes obtained but not effectively utilized due to command structures or competing priorities. The failure was not in the gathering of information, but in its integration into operational planning. The most tantalizing discovery came in 1945. During renovation of the old War Department building, workers discovered a sealed metal case inside a wall cavity. The case contained a journal belonging to Colonel Albert Myers, Chief Signal Officer of the Union Army. Among Myers' papers was a document dated January 3, 1863, proposing an integrated aerial observation system that would combine balloon reconnaissance with signal flag communications and field telegraph. The proposal included detailed plans for observation posts at regular intervals along defensive lines, each capable of launching a small observation balloon on short notice. Myers' proposal concluded, "The recent experiments conducted by the Balloon Corps, while imperfectly executed due to resource constraints, have demonstrated the fundamental validity of aerial observation. I submit that rather than abandoning this capability, we should be expanding and refining it." The document bears a simple notation in another hand, "Disapproved due to budgetary limitations, EMS." The initials belong to Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. This document suggests that some military leaders recognized the potential of aerial observation but were constrained by practical considerations. The technology existed, the concept was sound, but the organizational and financial infrastructure needed to fully realize its potential did not. The story of the Union Army Balloon Corps represents one of history's might-have-beens. A promising technology, pioneered under difficult conditions, demonstrated genuine utility, but failed to become institutionalized. The balloons that President Lincoln once approved as an experiment never fully evolved into an established component of military operations. In 1937, at a conference of military historians at West Point, Professor William Mitchell argued the dissolution of the Balloon Corps in 1863 set back the development of American military aviation by decades. Had the unit been maintained and developed, the aerial capabilities of the United States in the Spanish-American War and even World War I might have been significantly advanced. This counterfactual speculation cannot be proven, but it highlights the potential long-term costs of the decision to disband the Corps. What is certain is that Thaddeus Lowe and his aeronauts established principles of aerial observation that would eventually become fundamental to modern warfare. Their innovations, combining height, mobility, and instantaneous communication, prefigured developments that would later revolutionize military intelligence gathering. The balloons that some dismissed as useless toys were, in fact, harbingers of the future. The final word on the Union Army Balloon Corps might belong to Abraham Lincoln. According to a reminiscence published by Francis Bicknell Carpenter, who painted the president's portrait in 1864, Lincoln once remarked, "Professor Lowe's balloons may have seemed extravagant to some, but there is always value in seeing things from a higher perspective. In war, as in politics, the man who can rise above the fog has a distinct advantage." That perspective, seeing beyond immediate horizons, gaining the broader view, was precisely what the balloons offered. That the Union Army was not always able to translate that advantage into battlefield success reflects the complex realities of warfare and institutional change. Innovation alone is never sufficient. It must be accompanied by the organizational capacity to exploit its potential. The balloons that floated above the battlefields of the Civil War were more than curiosities or failed experiments. They represented America's first venture into the aerial dimension of warfare, a dimension that would, in time, become decisive. In their silent flights above the smoke and confusion of battle, they glimpsed a future that was still decades away, a future where control of the air would determine success on the ground. And so, the story of the useless hot air balloon Lincoln approved is not merely a historical footnote. It's a reminder that technological innovation often outpaces organizational adaptation, that visionaries frequently struggle against institutional inertia, and that seeing the future clearly does not always mean being able to reach it directly. The balloons rose, reported what they saw, and descended. That the information they provided was not always heeded does not diminish the significance of their achievement. They showed what was possible, even if the full realization of that possibility would have to wait for another generation and another war. According to a letter discovered in the personal papers of Thaddeus Lowe in 1940, he wrote to a former colleague in 1887, "I do not regret my service with the Balloon Corps, despite all frustrations and disappointments. We demonstrated the principle, even if we could not fully realize the practice. Others will come after us, who will perfect what we began. The view from above will become essential to all warfare, and men will wonder how battles were ever fought without it." In this prediction, at least, Thaddeus Lowe was entirely correct. The useless balloons had shown the way forward, even if few at the time could see the path clearly. In the years following the Civil War, Lowe returned to civilian life and continued his work in other scientific fields. Patent records from 1870 show that he developed several innovations in refrigeration technology, eventually establishing an ice-making business in California. His aeronautical expertise was largely redirected toward commercial and entertainment purposes. The military applications he had pioneered lay dormant. A newspaper interview with Lowe, published in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1882, included a reflection on his wartime service. "People often ask if I consider the Balloon Corps a failure. I do not. We accomplished remarkable things with minimal resources and limited understanding from military authorities. That we did not revolutionize warfare in a single conflict is hardly surprising. New capabilities require time to be fully appreciated and integrated. The most comprehensive assessment of the Balloon Corps' effectiveness came decades later. In 1927, the War Department commissioned a study titled Aerial Observation in the American Civil War, Lessons and Legacies. The classified report, only declassified in 1943, concluded, "The fundamental limitation facing Lowe's aeronauts was not technological, but doctrinal. Military commanders had no established procedures for incorporating aerial intelligence into tactical planning. Information that could not be immediately understood within existing frameworks was often disregarded, regardless of its potential value. This assessment was supported by evidence from multiple campaigns. During the Peninsula Campaign, balloon observations repeatedly identified Confederate troop movements that indicated preparations for counterattack. According to telegraphic transcripts dated June 24, 1862, Lowe reported, "Significant enemy forces observed moving toward our right flank, estimated 3 to 4 brigades with artillery." The report was received at McClellan's headquarters, but appears to have had little impact on Union dispositions. When Lee's attack came 2 days later, it achieved substantial surprise. The enigma of why such potentially valuable intelligence failed to affect operations has been the subject of historical debate. A partial explanation emerged in 1939, when analysis of McClellan's personal papers revealed a significant organizational flaw. There was no standardized process for evaluating and distributing intelligence from different sources. Reports from cavalry scouts, infantry pickets, civilian informants and balloon observations all followed different channels, with no central authority responsible for reconciling contradictions or identifying patterns. Colonel George H. Sharp, who later established the Bureau of Military Information, the Union Army's first formal intelligence unit, wrote in an 1874 memorandum, "The early years of the war saw information collection without proper analysis. Reports accumulated, but were seldom synthesized into coherent intelligence assessments. This structural deficiency negated much of the value of our reconnaissance efforts, regardless of the means employed." This organizational context helps explain the paradox of the Balloon Corps. It gathered valuable information that often failed to influence operations. The fault lay not with the balloons themselves, but with the military's inability to effectively utilize the intelligence they provided. Weather remained another persistent limitation. A meteorological study conducted by the Smithsonian Institution in 1931 analyzed weather records from 1861 through 1863 in the Virginia Theater of Operations. The study found that conditions suitable for balloon operations, low winds and good visibility, occurred on only about 40% of days. This inherent limitation meant that aerial observation could never serve as the sole reconnaissance method, but needed to be integrated with other intelligence-gathering techniques. Despite these challenges, the Balloon Corps achieved several notable successes that have been overlooked in many historical accounts. During the Battle of Gaines's Mill, on June 27, 1862, a balloon observation reported by telegraph at 2:15 p.m. identified a massive Confederate flanking movement against the Union left. This intelligence reached Brigadier General Fitz-John Porter in time to shift reinforcements to the threatened sector. While the Union forces were ultimately compelled to retreat, the timely reinforcement prevented the withdrawal from becoming a rout. Similarly, during the Battle of Malvern Hill on July 1, 1862, the final engagement of the 7 days' battles, balloon observations helped direct Union artillery fire against Confederate formations attempting to advance across open ground. According to the after-action report filed by Colonel Henry J. Hunt, Chief of Artillery, signals from the observation balloon provided timely notice of enemy concentrations beyond the ridgeline. This enabled adjustment of fire onto assembly areas not visible from ground-level observation posts. These tactical successes, however, were insufficient to overcome the strategic and organizational limitations facing the Corps. As the war progressed, the balloons were increasingly seen as luxuries rather than necessities in an army facing chronic shortages of more conventional supplies. A particularly revealing document came to light in 1944, when the diary of Treasury official Samuel Wilkinson was donated to the Library of Congress by his descendants. Wilkinson had attended a cabinet meeting on February 11, 1863, where the future of the Balloon Corps was discussed. According to his entry, Second Stanton presented a memorandum on military expenditures requiring reduction. Among the items listed for potential elimination was the Aeronautical Department, with annual costs of approximately $100,000. When asked for his opinion, the president remarked that while he found the balloons ingenious and occasionally useful, he would defer to the military judgment regarding their necessity in the current campaign. This account suggests that even Lincoln, initially an enthusiastic supporter, had come to view the balloons as expendable in the face of budgetary pressures. Without presidential protection, the Corps became vulnerable to the cost-cutting efforts of the War Department. The official termination of the Balloon Corps came through a War Department circular dated May 19, 1863, which simply stated, "The Aeronautical Department is hereby discontinued effective immediately. All equipment and materials are to be inventoried and transferred to the custody of the Quartermaster Department." No explanation was provided, and no replacement capability was established. Lowe's resignation 6 days later marked the effective end of American military aeronautics for nearly 4 decades. Not until the Spanish-American War would the U.S. Army again experiment with aerial observation using balloons during the Santiago campaign in 1898. Even then, the institutional memory of the Civil War experience had been largely lost. Captain William A. Glassford, who commanded the balloon detachment in Cuba, wrote in his report, "We have had to rediscover principles and techniques that should have been established doctrine." The lessons of Mr. Lowe's work a generation ago appear to have been entirely forgotten. This historical discontinuity represents perhaps the greatest failure associated with the Civil War Balloon Corps. Not that it was attempted and found wanting, but that its experiences and innovations were not preserved and developed. The Corps existed in an institutional vacuum, neither fully integrated into military structures, nor sustained long enough to establish its own traditions and practices. A particularly poignant illustration of this lost opportunity was discovered in 1934, when renovation work at West Point uncovered a crate of instructional materials in an abandoned storage room. Among these was a proposed curriculum dated October 1862, titled Principles of Aerial Reconnaissance, prepared by Thaddeus Lowe at the request of the Commandant. The document outlined a 6-week course covering balloon construction, operation, meteorological considerations, observation techniques, and the interpretation of aerial intelligence. A notation on the cover page, dated January 1863, stated simply, "Returned without action, current curriculum already overcrowded. Perhaps consider at a later date." That later date would not come until the early 20th century, after the aviation innovations of the Wright brothers had rendered balloon technology largely obsolete for military purposes. What might have developed had the Balloon Corps been maintained and institutionalized remains one of the intriguing counterfactuals of military history. Colonel Billy Mitchell, one of the pioneers of American air power, wrote in a 1925 article, "Had the Union Army properly developed the aerial capability demonstrated by Lowe, American military aviation might have evolved along an entirely different trajectory. Instead of playing catch-up with European powers in 1917, we might have been leaders in the field." The dissolution of the Balloon Corps also had personal consequences for many of those involved. Of the approximately 50 men who served as aeronauts or support personnel in the Corps, military pension records show that only 3 received any recognition of their service in the form of veterans' benefits. The majority, classified as civilian contractors rather than soldiers, were ineligible for pensions despite having faced combat conditions and contributed to the war effort. John LaMountain, who had operated balloons independently in the Eastern Theater before being absorbed into Lowe's organization, died in poverty in 1878. An obituary in the Buffalo Express noted, Once he ascended above the clouds for his country. At the end, his country had forgotten him entirely. Similar fates befell many of the Corps' personnel, their specialized skills finding little application in the post-war economy. Lowe himself fared better, achieving financial success through his refrigeration patents and other business ventures. Yet, in his personal correspondence, a sense of missed opportunity persists. In a letter to former Assistant Secretary of War Thomas Scott, dated 1876, Lowe wrote, "I cannot help but reflect on what might have been accomplished had our aerial department received the support and development it deserved. The ascents we made during the war revealed only the barest glimpse of the potential value of commanding the aerial perspective." The most balanced historical assessment of the Union Army Balloon Corps was probably that offered by military historian Matthew Forney Steele in his 1911 work, American Campaigns. Steele wrote, "The balloons represented a capability ahead of its time, not technologically, for the basic principles had been established decades earlier, but institutionally. The Army lacked the doctrinal framework to fully exploit aerial observation, the command structures to properly integrate the resulting intelligence, and the institutional commitment to develop the capability over time. These deficiencies, rather than any inherent limitation of balloon technology itself, explain why this promising innovation yielded less than its full potential." This assessment aligns with more recent scholarship. Military innovation historian Elliot A. Cohen, in a 1994 analysis, characterized the Balloon Corps as a classic case of a technical capability outpacing organizational adaptation, a situation that would be repeated with the introduction of wireless communication, mechanization, and eventually computers. The balloons could gather information effectively, but the Army had not evolved the structures needed to process and utilize that information. The final word on the significance of the Civil War Balloon Corps might belong to the aviators of World War I, who faced similar challenges of proving the value of aerial observation to sometimes skeptical ground commanders. Lieutenant Colonel James McCudden, a British observation pilot, wrote in 1918, "It is humbling to realize that American balloonists demonstrated the fundamental principles of our work more than 50 years ago. While our aircraft offer advantages of speed and mobility, the essential function, seeing what cannot be seen from the ground and communicating it promptly to those who need the information, remains unchanged." The balloons that floated above the Virginia countryside in 1861 and 1862 were indeed harbingers of a future form of warfare. That the future they glimpsed would be realized primarily by others, after a gap of decades, does not diminish the significance of what Lowe and his aeronauts achieved. They demonstrated, under the difficult conditions of wartime, that the aerial perspective could transform military operations, that this transformation would require not just technical innovation, but institutional evolution, was a lesson that would be learned and relearned throughout the history of military aviation. In 1937, a small monument was erected at Fort Corcoran, Virginia, on the site where Lowe had conducted some of his first military demonstrations. The inscription reads, "From this spot, the Earth was first viewed through the eyes of war from the perspective previously reserved for birds and angels. Though briefly operational and never fully utilized, the Union Army Balloon Corps established principles that would eventually transform the conduct of warfare. What began here as an experiment would, in time, become essential." This epitaph aptly summarizes the legacy of the useless hot air balloon Lincoln approved. Initially dismissed as a curiosity, the military observation balloon eventually proved to be a glimpse of the future. A future where control of the air and the intelligence it provided would become central to military operations. The path from Lowe's silk balloons to modern aerial reconnaissance was neither direct nor continuous. but the fundamental insight that the view from above changes everything has endured and expanded beyond anything the Civil War aeronauts could have imagined. The fragmented records of the Balloon Corps, scattered across archives and only partially reconstructed by generations of historians, testify to both the promise of innovation and the challenges of institutional adaptation. The balloons rose, reported what they saw, and descended into history, their full potential unrealized in their time, but vindicated by the future they helped to create. As Thaddeus Lowe himself wrote in the final entry of his unpublished memoir, found among his papers after his death in 1913, the view from the balloon basket was never merely about seeing farther or more clearly, though it certainly provided those advantages. It was about seeing differently, perceiving patterns and relationships invisible from the ground. That difference in perspective, more than any technical capability, represented the true revolution we offered. Some revolutions take longer than others to unfold. Ours, I believe, is still unfolding. In that assessment, Lowe was more prescient than he could have known. The revolution in perspective that began with his balloons over the Potomac has continued to evolve through aerial photography, satellite imagery, drones, and beyond. Each development expanding our capacity to see and understand the world from above. The seemingly useless balloons, approved by Abraham Lincoln, were, in fact, the first step on a journey that continues to this day, a journey toward mastery of the aerial dimension and the unprecedented perspective it provides. As we look back across the span of more than a century and a half, we can now recognize that Lowe and his fellow aeronauts were not failures, but forerunners. Their balloons did not win the Civil War, but they helped establish principles that would eventually transform all warfare. In that sense, they were not useless at all, but rather useful before their time, pioneers whose full vindication would come not in their own era, but in the future they helped to create.